Hostile worlds, bad systems, cosmic mistakes, ordinary people caught in forces too large to fight. These aren't stories about heroes, they're stories about endurance and what breaks when technology outpaces wisdom. Strap in, check your air. This is Vicious Planets.
Vicious Planets. Season 0, Episode 7. Clones got too expensive, so they just threw rednecks at the problem. A public access transmission from the outer limits of administrative sanity. Recorded testimony. Terraforming contractor Jed Barnes. Filed with the Interstellar Agricultural Oversight Board. Transcript corrected for transmission static. Witness declined to remove hat. People always ask how Big Blue Miner got started. They expect some fancy story. Orbital mirrors, nanotech soil printers, atmospheric processors humming away like church organs while the planet politely turns green. Some fellow in a white coat pressing a button and stepping back to watch nature take its cues. A press release, a ribbon cutting, somebody shaking hands in front of a viewport with a newly blue horizon behind them while the cameras click. That ain't what happened. Truth is, clones got too expensive. The labor clone program had been running for about 30 years when the economics finally caught up with the biology. Turns out maintaining a human being, even a vat-grown one with simplified paperwork, costs roughly the same as maintaining a regular human being. Food, medical, psychological stabilization, which apparently clones need a lot of on account of the existential situation they find themselves in. The corporate lawyers had been arguing for a decade about whether clone distress counted as a liability. The accountants didn't wait for the answer, so they just threw rednecks at the problem. That's not my phrase. That's what the budget memo actually said. I saw a copy. Someone in procurement had written, "Given current clone maintenance costs, we recommend substituting rural agricultural contractors at an estimated savings of 340% over a 5-year terraforming cycle." The word rednecks appeared in the margin in different handwriting. I always figured that was the VP of operations adding his personal assessment. We took it as a compliment. The planet. Official name, Alpha Centauri 1-7. Nobody calls it that. We call it Big Blue Miner because it circles a gas giant so big and so blue you can see it filling half the sky if you stand in the right valley. Not like looking at a moon. More like someone parked an ocean on its side and forgot to take it home. You never quite get used to it. 5 years I spent on that rock, and every morning I'd step outside and see that thing hanging up there and think, right, that's still there. Some of the crew painted it on things, lunchboxes, equipment panels. One fellow from Laramie got it tattooed on his forearm, which is either poetic or practical, depending on whether you think you might forget what planet you're working on. What you couldn't prepare for was that it had weather. You could stand on the ground and watch storm systems the size of continents rotating in the upper bands, taking weeks to complete a turn. Lightning that fired inside the cloud layers and didn't stop for hours, lighting up structures so large they had no name in any language. Not storms, not clouds, just masses of gas moving according to physics that usually applies to things bigger than you're supposed to look directly at. The cloud bands shifted color as you watched, blue into violet into something between the two that your eye kept trying to classify and couldn't. On still evenings, the whole thing would catch the light at an angle that made it look, briefly, like it was lit from the inside, like it was thinking. The fellow from Laramie would stare at it for long stretches without saying anything, and none of us ever asked what he was looking at because we already knew. The little world itself wasn't much when we got there. Thin air, not enough to kill you fast, just enough to make everything feel slightly wrong, like breathing through a screen door. You'd be fine at rest. You'd be fine walking. Do anything more strenuous than carry a full load uphill, and you'd feel it in about 20 minutes. A faint headache behind the eyes, a kind of tiredness that didn't feel earned. We wore respirators for the first 8 months and resented every one of them. Rock dust the color of old brick, fine enough that it got into everything. Machinery, food, the creases of your hands, your bedding. the corners of your eyes when you slept. You'd find it in your ears at night and wonder how it made the journey. There's a specific kind of grit that a dry alien world puts in your teeth, and it doesn't taste like anything on Earth, and it doesn't taste like nothing either. It took 2 years before I stopped noticing it. I'm not sure that counts as adjusting or as giving up. And a day-night cycle so slow, one full rotation takes about 50 years. I'll say that again because it deserves the space. 50 years. One day. The sun rises and it keeps rising for 25 years, and then it sets and the dark lasts 25 more. That fact alone disqualified the planet from about 40% of conventional terraforming models. Most of the theoretical soil science assumed a 24-hour light cycle. Most of the engineered microbial systems were built around it. One hemisphere cooks while the other freezes, and the only place anything interesting can happen is the long strip of twilight running between them like a crooked seam in old denim. Here is what that actually means, standing on the ground. You can watch the sun move. Not the way you track it at home, where by the time you notice it's moved, the moment's already gone. Here you sit down for 20 minutes, look up, and you can see it. Just barely, just enough. Higher than it was. Like watching a clock hand that is also a star. We had crew members who would spend their lunch breaks doing exactly this, not out of boredom, but because they couldn't stop. There is something in the human eye that is designed to track that movement, that expects the arc, and when the arc is slow enough to follow consciously, it becomes the most patient, enormous, beautiful thing you have ever watched. Some of the crew found it peaceful in a way they couldn't quite explain. The planet giving you time to look at the thing you never had time to look at. That strip was ours. It is always the last 20 minutes of a summer afternoon. Shadows run long and sideways and don't change. Everything is lit from the left or the right, depending on which direction you're facing, but always horizontal, always at that angle that photographers chase for 10 minutes a day and we lived in permanently. The rocks glow. The dust glows a deeper red. Big Blue catches that light on its upper cloud bands and throws it back in colors that don't have names, and the whole valley looks like something important is about to happen. And it keeps looking like that. And eventually you understand that on this world, unlike every other world any human being has ever stood on, the light is not a mood. It's just the light. It is what light is here. Your brain slowly stops reading it as an event and starts reading it as a place. And that is either the strangest or the most reasonable thing that happens to you out there, depending on the day. The only genuinely interesting thing about the planet, before we got there, was the soil mites. Tiny critters living in the dust. No bigger than a grain of pollen, most of them. Burrowers, hard to kill. They could eat just about anything organic and convert it into something halfway resembling soil, which on a planet with almost no organic material meant they mostly ate each other and waited. Corporate science boys had been writing papers about them for 20 years. Beautiful little papers. Careful methodology. Excellent microscopy. Not one practical application in the lot. Nobody had figured out what to do with them. We figured it out inside of 6 months. The original solutions. They tried domes first. Little glass cities with hydroponic racks and imported microbes. Temperature controlled. Humidity managed. Everything very precise and very fragile. That worked fine for about 18 months until the storms cracked the seals on Habitat C, and the atmosphere decided to remind everybody it wasn't invited to the party. Lost 3 growing cycles. The engineers flew out, patched the seals, wrote a report with a lot of charts in it. The storms came back, cracked them again. Different seals this time, which the engineers found interesting, and the colonists found deeply unencouraging. The atmosphere was patient. It had time. Then they tried the Genesis bomb, one of those big nuclear soil starter devices, the kind that had worked reasonably well on a couple of low-atmosphere moons in the outer system. The theory was sound enough. Blast nutrients into the crust, superheat the upper rock layer, kickstart a chain of chemical reactions that would give the native microbes something to actually work with. Corporate approved the budget in about 40 minutes, which tells you something about how boards respond to the word nuclear versus the word patient. All it did was make a crater. Which, to be fair, is also what farming looks like if you're doing it very wrong and very fast. The crater was impressive. I'll give them that. You could see it from orbit on a clear pass. This perfect dark circle in the brick-red dust, like someone had stubbed out a cigar the size of a county. But the nutrient dispersal failed because there wasn't enough organic material in the crust to react with, and the superheating killed off about 30% of the local mite population in the surrounding region, which was the one biological asset the planet actually had. They had bombed their own best tool. That's when someone on a budget committee, not a scientist, just a person who was good at reading numbers and bad at pretending otherwise, noticed something. You could send 100 agricultural engineers from land-grant universities into space for the cost of maintaining one clone labor force for a year. And agricultural engineers, the real ones, the ones who grew up understanding that soil is not a medium, but an ecosystem, not a surface, but a community. Those people already knew something the orbital scientists didn't. You can't build a planet. You can only wake one up. The crew. We recruited from the right places: Kansas, Nebraska, eastern Colorado, parts of Oklahoma where the wind never stops arguing with the horizon, and the only people who stay are the ones who genuinely love dirt. Every one of us had advanced degrees, just not from the kind of universities that got invited to orbital symposiums. I had a doctorate in soil microbiology from Kansas State. My colleague, Dr. Vasquez, everybody called her Paz, had 2 publications on mycorrhizal networks in drought-stressed perennial systems that were cited more times than she could count and paid her about as well as you'd expect academic ecology to pay. Our livestock specialist, a big, quiet man from the Nebraska sandhills named Darnell, had spent 15 years breeding hog hybrids for high-stress environments before anyone thought to aim one of those environments at a different planet. Our atmospheric botanist, Heike, had come over from a German agricultural college with opinions about root architecture that she would share whether you asked or not, and she was usually right. We didn't look impressive. That was by design, almost. Land-grant people have a particular relationship with being underestimated. You learn early that the easiest way to do good work is to let someone else think they're supervising it. When we landed, the first thing we did was stop talking and start looking. What we found. The native ecosystem wasn't dead. That was the thing the dome builders and the bomb droppers had missed. It was waiting. There's a difference, and it matters enormously. Dead things don't have a plan. Waiting things do. They just need a reason. 4 root plants dominated the dry basins of the twilight belt. The mud yam, which looked like nothing so much as a half-rotten sweet potato and tasted about the same, ran taproots down 20 meters into ancient stone and pulled mineral moisture from cracks too small to see. Paz ate one on the first survey and spent the next hour questioning her life choices, then wrote 4 pages of notes about the root architecture. That was Paz. She was also the loudest voice against the hog idea when I first proposed it. Not loudest in a way that caused problems. Paz wasn't built for causing problems. She was built for being precise. But she sat across the planning table from me for 2 hours one evening and walked through every reason the mite-hog interface was speculative: the risk of pathogen introduction, the possibility that the intestinal microbiome of an earth hog would outcompete the native colonies rather than feed them. She had a list. It was a good list. I told her I agreed with most of it, and we were doing it anyway. She looked at me for a moment, the way Paz looked at things she had not yet classified. And then she said, "Fine, but I want full fecal sampling from week 1. I said she could have whatever she wanted. The fecal sampling was, in the end, how we caught the mite colonization happening 3 months before we saw it in the soil, which was the first real evidence the whole approach was working. Paz presented that data in the morning briefing with the specific expression of a person who has been proven wrong in the best possible way and is choosing to say nothing about it. The holler tuber, named by Heike, who said it hollered at you with its smell when you cut it open and who was correct, spread lateral root networks across a quarter-mile radius and fed sugars through mycorrhizal threads to anything growing within reach, including the mites. It was operating, essentially, as a voluntary feeding station for the entire local ecosystem. On Earth, we would have called it generous. On Big Blue Minor, we called it the reason anything else was alive. The belly bulb stored water in a central chamber behind a membrane so fine you could hold the whole structure up to the light and watch moisture bead on the inside surface like a little private weather system. It released that water into surrounding soil slowly, continuously, without being asked. Darnell found the first one and brought it back to camp, and we all stood around looking at it for a while without saying much. It was that kind of thing. And the fire plug tubers, which grew in clusters at geological fault lines and had developed a relationship with a specific strain of mite so intimate that neither one seemed to fully function without the other. The mites built their primary colonies on fire plug root surfaces. The fire plugs, in turn, secreted a compound that the mites used for reproduction. We spent 2 months trying to figure out which one had come first. Eventually, Heike pointed out that the question assumed a beginning that might predate our ability to find it, and we moved on. Each one of those plants was running taproots deeper than any terrestrial crop any of us had worked with, 30 meters sometimes, deeper in places where the geology opened up. They were drinking moisture from the ancient stone and feeding it upward through a system that had been running quietly and patiently for longer than our civilization had been keeping records. The problem was simple, and the solution was obvious once you stopped trying to impose something from outside and started listening to what was already there. There wasn't enough organic material cycling through the system. The plants were alive. The mites were alive. The relationship between them was intact and functional and old, but without a large animal introducing mass quantities of nitrogen-rich organic waste into the cycle, without something big and warm and messy living and eating and producing at scale, the whole system turned over too slowly to build toward anything. Like a fire that has every condition for burning but not enough fuel to sustain the flame. It needed mass, it needed volume, it needed something that ate a lot and wasn't shy about it. The planet was running at about 2% of its potential. We had the other 98% in a cargo hold. The hog idea. Some orbital fellow flew out about 4 months in. Very nice man. Sent by corporate to assess our material requirements. He had a tablet full of requisition forms and a look of careful optimism that I recognized as someone who had been told this assignment would be straightforward. He asked what kind of reactor we needed. Fusion array, maybe? Or one of the new thermal pulse systems. Something with a control panel and a warranty and a quarterly maintenance contract. I told him we already had our reactor. Pigs. He looked at me for a long time after that. Long enough that Darnell, who was sitting across the table eating lunch, looked up to see what the silence was about and then looked back down again. I was not joking. Hogs convert biomass into microbial fertilizer faster than any machine humans have built. A single hog processes roughly its own body weight in plant material every 3 weeks and returns it to the soil in a form that bacteria and mites can use almost immediately. The microbial community in a healthy hog gut is extraordinary, diverse, adaptive, heavily populated, constantly working. Now, hogs are many things. Patient is not one of them, but they don't need to be patient. That's the whole point. You run enough hogs across enough ground and you're not farming. You're operating a biological engine with legs and opinions. The orbital fellow wrote something on his tablet. I couldn't see what it was. I have thought about it since. My best guess, based on the look on his face and the particular way a person holds a stylus when they are writing something they expect to be questioned about later, is that he wrote, "Contractor recommends pigs." And then probably sat there for a moment deciding whether to add any context and decided against it because there is no context that helps that sentence, and anyone who needed context wasn't going to understand it anyway. He flew back out 2 days later. We never met again. I hope his report made it into the official record somewhere. I hope whoever reads it has the same expression Darnell had at that table, the one that means, I am not surprised, and also, I kind of am. We started small, a few transport rigs full of pig hybrids, bred for high-gravity livestock colonies, compact and hardy and bad-tempered in the particular way that hogs get when they're healthy and well-fed, and have decided that whatever is on the other side of that fence is their business. We turned them loose in the tuber basins and fed them the roots and waited. 3 weeks in, the first herd stopped eating. Just stopped. Standing around in the basin, looking at the mud yams and not touching them. Every metric was fine. Temperature, respiration, no signs of illness that any of us could identify. The corporate livestock manual had nothing useful to say about it. I was starting to compose a report in my head that I did not want to write when Darnell walked out into the basin, stood among the herd for about 10 minutes, and came back and said, "They're bored." I asked him what that meant in practical terms. He said it meant they needed variety, that hogs on a single food source this long start to associate the smell of it with a trap, that it was a welfare behavior he'd seen in high-stress colony environments, and the fix was rotation. We pulled the holler tuber reserves out of storage. We'd been saving them as a soil amendment, and mixed them into the feed. The herd was eating again within an hour. Darnell did not make a thing of it. That was also Darnell. The planet did exactly what we expected. Hogs eat. Hogs digest. Hogs produce what agricultural science politely calls liquid manure, and what everybody else calls something shorter and more accurate. And it turns out the local mites absolutely loved it. Colonized the hog intestinal microbiome within months. We found mite signatures in fecal samples before we found them in any of the new soil deposits forming along the herd corridors. We didn't engineer that. We just gave it somewhere to go. Every time a hog relieved itself on that dusty red ground, we were planting a microbial colony already calibrated to the planet, already carrying its chemical vocabulary, already in conversation with the root systems nearby. It spread the way good information spreads in a small community. Quietly, thoroughly, and in every direction at once. The mite networks expanded outward from every herd corridor. The holler tuber laterals shifted direction toward the richest deposits over the course of a single growing season. The belly bulbs started releasing more water. The fireplug tubers started fruiting in areas where they'd been dormant for longer than we could measure. Within 14 months of the first hog deployment, the soil depth in the primary basin had increased by a measurable factor, and the atmospheric oxygen reading in the twilight belt had moved, just barely, just enough to notice, in the right direction. The planet was beginning to remember what it knew how to do. The Dark Side Project. Now remember that 50-year rotation. Half the planet stays dark for decades at a stretch. Cold, airless in any practical sense. The kind of dark that has weight to it when you stand at the twilight edge and look out into it. Most terraforming models wrote the dark hemisphere off entirely. Too expensive to heat, too slow to matter, too far from the active belt to factor into any timescale a budget committee would approve. We disagreed. The dark side wasn't a liability. It was cold storage the size of a continent, already underground, already thermally stable, already threaded with the ancient root architecture of plants that had been managing the transition between hemispheres since before the first mite burrowed into the first grain of that dust. It was infrastructure. It just didn't look like any infrastructure built by people. So we started blasting caverns down there. Big ones, not domes. We were done with domes. These were open chambers carved into bedrock below the frost line, connected by passages wide enough to drive equipment through, designed to trap and accumulate heat and moisture over long periods without requiring anyone to maintain a seal. I want to be honest about what it felt like to stand at the twilight line and look out into that dark before the first blast. The cold came off it the way cold comes off a freezer door left open. Not air movement, just presence, a temperature you could feel from 10 meters back. The sky over the dark side was absolutely clear and absolutely black. No big blue, no horizon glow, nothing. The kind of dark that makes the stars look closer than they have any right to be. We had core samples showing the root architecture was down there. We had thermal models suggesting the geology would hold heat if we gave it a cavity to hold it in. We had, in other words, a theory and a drill bit, and the knowledge that corporate had approved this budget line, partly because the word geothermal sounded more serious than the word pigs. Heike said, "It will work." She said it once, not to reassure anyone, just as a statement of her considered professional opinion, and then she went back to her models. We blasted. Geology is a better engineer than glass when you give it the right conditions. Then we drove the hog herds across the twilight line in monster livestock haulers. Enormous tracked vehicles, the kind that make a noise like a slow earthquake and leave ruts you can see from low orbit. 300 animals at a time. The hogs were unhappy about this and made their feelings known at volume. We drove them underground and pumped the slurry into the chamber floors and left the mite colonies to do what mite colonies do when you give them warmth and waste and time. I have been asked to describe what it sounds like to drive 300 hogs into a cavern blasted into the frozen underside of an alien world. The answer is very loud, and then louder than that, and then the echo starts. Sound behaves differently in fresh blasted rock than it does in finished spaces. The walls are irregular, the ceiling height varies, and there is no furniture or insulation or anything soft to absorb what 300 animals produce when they are cold and disoriented and expressing their feelings about it. Darnell rode in the lead hauler every run. He said you got used to it. The rest of us took his word for it. What I can tell you is that when you drove back out into the twilight and the ramp sealed behind you and the sound cut off, the silence felt like something you could lean against. Big Blue Miner had never been loud before we got there. We were doing our best to fix that. The mites followed, the roots followed. I went down into the chambers about 6 months in, just to look. You had to want to go. It required suiting up, running the ramp in a vehicle that smelled permanently of hog regardless of how many times Darnell cleaned it, and descending into rock-black dark lit only by work lamps strung along the passage walls. But I wanted to see it. What I saw was this. The walls, which had been raw blasted stone, were furred. Not thickly, not dramatically, just a fine, pale growth along the lower sections where the holler tuber starts had taken hold. Something between moss and root system that had no exact name yet, because no one had seen it before. The floor was darker than the walls, moisture pooling in the low spots. Not much, just enough to reflect the work lamps back at you in long orange streaks. It smelled of earth. Not alien earth, not the dry brick dust smell of the surface, just earth, the smell that means something is alive and working. I stood in there for longer than I needed to. Heike's models said it would work. Standing in that chamber, in the dark, under a frozen hemisphere, I thought, yes, it will. We seeded the chamber walls with belly bulb cuttings and holler tuber starts. Within 18 months, the chamber floors were showing genuine soil development, real topsoil, layered and living and holding moisture the way good ground holds moisture. Not a lot, not yet, but real. And once soil holds water long enough underground, something wonderful and inevitable happens above it. Rain. First storm on Big Blue Miner lasted 3 weeks. We tracked it on every instrument we had, and also just by standing outside and letting it happen to us, which is not standard meteorological procedure, but which I recommend. I remember the smell, but before the smell, there was the light. Rain on a world that has never had rain falls differently than rain on a world that has. There is no soil dark with memory, no gutters, no understanding built into the land of where water goes. It hit the brick red dust, and the dust didn't know what to do with it. For the first hour, the drops just sat where they landed, little dark circles, distinct, each one a separate fact. Then slowly, the ground began to figure it out. We stood in it and watched it figure it out. 20-some scientists and engineers from the plains of North America, standing in alien rain on the surface of a world that was, in that moment, learning something for the very first time. Whole planet smelled like wet earth and hog pens, and something older underneath both of those. Something the planet had been keeping to itself for a very long time, and had finally decided to share. The ancient moisture in the stone. The root chemistry of plants that had been waiting without complaint for this exact moment. The mites in it somehow, or the smell of what mites make when they're working at full capacity in good wet soil. Some of the men cried, including me, briefly, which I'm noting for the record before someone else does. We did not discuss it afterward. That's just how it is with farmers and rain. Some things are between you and the weather. The solar equator. Meanwhile, the engineers were doing their own work on the surface. Since the planet spins so slow, the best location for solar collection isn't fixed. It's a moving boundary, the advancing line of daylight creeping across the equatorial belt at a pace slow enough to track by eye over days. Conventional fixed arrays would cook in full exposure during the long dawn and freeze solid waiting for the next one. You needed to follow the light without chasing it. So they built a continuous solar trunk line along the equator. Not stationary panels, but a linked network of collection arrays anchored just inside the dark zone, positioned to catch the leading edge of daylight without sitting in full exposure long enough to overheat. The line moved with the terminator, or the terminator moved toward it, which amounts to the same thing on the relevant timescale and sounds considerably less expensive. Under each panel array, we buried mite hives. This was our idea, not the engineers. They looked at us the same way the orbital fellow had looked at me when I said pigs. But the logic held. The shade from the panels protected the mites from thermal shock at the light-dark boundary. The warmth generated by the collection equipment gave them a thermal gradient to work with. Mites follow a thermal gradient the way water follows a slope, not quickly, but without exception. They burrowed deeper along the panel lines than anywhere else on the surface. The root systems followed. And on a world trying to build an atmosphere, root systems working in new soil do something that matters more than almost anything else. They make oxygen, slowly, less than you'd think at first, but steadily, season after season, without being managed or maintained or asked. Moss appeared along the panel lines before it appeared anywhere else. Small, dark, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. Growing in the mite-worked soil in the shelter of the array overhangs, protected from radiation, fed by the root sugar network spreading beneath it. A few square meters at first, then more. Then the twilight belt was threaded with green so faint it looked like shadow from a distance and like something quietly alive up close. We tracked the atmospheric oxygen readings obsessively, posted the numbers in the mess every morning, watched them the way you watch a difficult patient's temperature, not celebrating, not yet, just watching, because the watching matters and because hope is easier to carry when you've got a number to put it on. The day the respirators became optional was a Tuesday in what we were calling the third local year, which is a somewhat fictional unit of time on a planet with a 50-year rotation, but which gave us something to count. Somebody had written optional in large letters on the equipment board and propped a single hog pen shovel underneath it as a joke that required no explanation. We wore the respirators for another 2 weeks anyway, because old habits are old habits, and also because Paz pointed out that optional was doing a lot of work in that sentence, and she wasn't wrong. That was still a good day. The planetary engine. The solar trunk line generated more power than the operation needed. Way more, during the periods when Big Blue's magnetosphere sent solar storms rolling through the system. The gas giant's magnetic field is enormous, and it charges anything in range for weeks at a stretch, which is inconvenient if you're flying and extremely convenient if you have a large stationary grid and a list of things you need power for. We used the surplus to drive geothermal drills, not mining, nothing extractive. Heat pumps working slowly downward through old volcanic strata, cycling warmth back into the crust in the specific layers where the ancient magnetic materials were concentrated. The goal was simple in theory and enormous in practice. Wake up the planet's dead magnetic field. Spin it back up. A world with a functioning magnetosphere holds its atmosphere against the slow pressure of solar wind. Without one, all the oxygen work we were doing, all the moss and the root systems, and the mite networks, and the carefully seeded soil chambers, would bleed off into space over centuries, patient and inevitable, no matter how hard we worked. The drills ran for months before the first readings moved. When they did, it was not dramatic. A single instrument on the sensor array ticked one unit in the right direction and stayed there. Paz taped a printout of that reading to the mess hall wall and wrote next to it, in her careful handwriting, "This is the magnetosphere waking up." Nobody took it down. Darnell called it farming for somebody else's grandchildren. Heike disagreed with that framing. She said grandchildren was too conservative an estimate, and somebody's was doing a lot of work in that sentence. She had modeled the magnetic field recovery timeline, and she thought Darnell was being optimistic. This was the one area where Heike turned out to be wrong. The geothermal program moved faster than her models predicted, which she attributed to an underestimation of the existing thermal gradient in the lower strata, and which Darnell attributed to the hogs, as a joke, repeatedly, for the remaining 2 years of the project. Heike said he could attribute it to whatever he liked as long as the readings kept improving. Darnell said he would. They had this exchange, in various forms, approximately once a month until we shipped out. I wrote it down because it seemed like the kind of thing worth having a record of. That's exactly what it was. The orbital scientists said it couldn't be done on our timeline. We said we weren't working on their timeline. Big Blue. Now, the gas giant itself is another story, and one I'm not fully qualified to tell. What I can tell you is what it looks like from the ground, because I looked at it every day for 5 years, and I have opinions. Blue, the way deep ocean water is blue, not a surface color, but something that goes down further than light reaches. Storms visible from the crust as slow, dark spirals, unhurried, the size of continents, turning with a patience that makes the 50-year rotation of our little rock look impulsive. Lightning in the cloud layers that flashes and doesn't stop for hours, illuminating the undersides of structures large enough that I don't have good words for their scale. Some mornings, when the angle is right and the upper atmosphere is clear, you can see shapes moving in the clouds. Long shapes, slow ones. The skyfishers know what they are. I have theories. The skyfishers work that place on days off, taking flying barges up into the upper cloud layers with atmosphere nets and the kind of patience that some men are born with and others develop after enough years doing jobs that can't be rushed. They hunt things that drift through the clouds like eels made of lightning and attitude. That's the best description I've managed, and I've had 5 years to improve it. 2 AI systems run the floating collection platforms up there. Ancient machines. Older than the current operation by a long stretch. Old enough that their original designation numbers have been lost to record-keeping failures and general indifference. Everybody calls them the Clanker brothers, Clanker 1 and Clanker 2, and the machines have long since accepted the names the way a person accepts a nickname given by someone they like, without making a thing of it. They're good at their work. They manage the atmospheric skimming platforms, maintain the mining equipment, and enforce the safety protocols that keep the entire gas giant from doing something dramatic. Big Blue's atmosphere contains enough combustible material that one poorly planned operation could theoretically ignite the upper cloud layers. The Clankers take this seriously. They have a list of rules, and they explain it once, politely, and don't have the conversation twice. They also, when they have someone to talk to, turn out to be genuinely pleasant company. They invite us up to fish whenever we get time. There's something in the way they extend the invitation, not perfunctory, not automated, but specific, remembering who mentioned interest, and following up when the season changes and conditions are good. That suggests the company matters to them. I can't speak to what an AI experiences in the way of loneliness, but I know what it looks like when someone is glad you stopped by. I keep meaning to go. Big Blue Miner keeps us busy. Planets take a while to grow up, and there's always something that needs doing before you take a day off. Another herd to move. Another soil reading to pull, another chamber to check, another panel array to walk, another morning of standing in the twilight with that enormous blue weight filling half the sky and thinking about all the work still left and how much of it you'll never live to see finished and whether that matters. It doesn't, I've decided. You do the work anyway. That's what farming is. You do the work anyway. Final note. So that's the truth of it, as best I can put it in words suitable for an official record. No miracle technology, no orbital genius pressing a button, no ribbon cutting. Just a budget memo with a word in the margin, 100 people from the plains with advanced degrees and dirty boots, and the oldest technology in agricultural science, which is paying close attention to what the ground already knows and then getting out of its way. The Interstellar Agricultural Oversight Board has requested, in their official capacity, that I describe our methodology in terms compatible with standard terraforming classification systems. I have made 3 attempts. The form keeps running out of boxes. I have submitted a note suggesting the form be redesigned and have not yet received a response, which I understand is also a kind of response. What we did, stripped down to what actually happened, is this. We found a world that had been waiting for a very long time for something large and warm and alive to arrive and make a mess. We brought the mess. We brought it in the form of hog hybrids and slurry pumps, and a crew of soil scientists who could recite nitrogen cycle chemistry in their sleep, and who did, occasionally, when the work ran long and the air was still thin, and the big blue planet hung in the dark sky outside the mess hall window like a question nobody had quite answered yet. The planet did the rest. It knew what to do. It had always known. The answer, as it turned out, was 10,000 hogs. End of recorded testimony, VP-S0-E7. Witness was offered refreshments, declined, asked if there was somewhere he could wash his hands. There was.
Vicious Planets is a science fiction podcast about hostile worlds, bad systems, cosmic mistakes, and ordinary people caught in forces too large to fight. These aren't stories about heroes. They're stories about people who do the work anyway. This episode is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to real planets, real livestock, or real procurement officers who approve something they did not fully read is entirely coincidental. Nothing here constitutes legal, medical, agricultural, or veterinary advice. Do not attempt to terraform a world based on this transmission, and do not throw hogs at a problem without first consulting somebody who is not the contractor. The Interstellar Agricultural Oversight Board has reviewed these statements and asked that they be restated in standard terms. The contractor declined. He is also keeping the hat. File all forms in triplicate. Always know where your oxygen tank is at.